Okay, so this week we're looking at the question of war and genocide. We're moving to these kind of mass organized state-based forms of violence, which we pointed out previously actually sometimes kill many more people than things like the individual murderers. But again, taking our particular approach, which is to not only look at the events, the causes of the events, the perpetrators of the events, but to look at the meaning of the forms of violence. Okay, so we've already been exploring the way in which people understand and experience violence through interpretative frameworks. And that these interpretative frameworks come from somewhere. They come from the media around them, the cultures around them, the education that they receive, the what's in the news. And we also pointed out that these ideas are often not consistent with the evidence. For instance, we looked at the way in which a lot of people believe that society is getting more dangerous, even though we can show that things like the homicide rate are dropping very significantly. And the next thing we pointed out was that these interpretive frameworks can be used to kind of both justify and incite violence. For instance, interpretative frameworks that make people feel threatened or persecuted or paranoid often lead them to become violent. And some of the examples we thought about there was the sovereign citizens movement. We've had two incidents of police being shot by these sovereign citizens who believed that their rights not to be accountable to a state criminal justice authority was being threatened. Similarly, we explored the way in which the Christchurch mass shooter had a set of beliefs that led him to think that going and killing all those people would be a kind of a justified action, and one that would win him kind of respect. And once again, we see that these beliefs are both trigger violence, but are also often very disconnected from reality. And the interesting thing is, it's often not just an individual with counterfactual beliefs, but you have entire communities and even entire nations that may have ways of thinking about what's going on that are actually deeply disconnected from the historical evidence. So what is it about states and violence? Because often we think about individual violence, criminal violence, the mugger, the rapist, the murderer. And states are uniquely positioned to be violent in two different ways. Going back to the kind of sociologist Weber, he said that one of the things that defines a state is having a monopoly on violence. That means that the state, one of the things it does is it claims that it has the legitimate use of violence and that citizens and other social groups don't have. So the state has the right to have a police force that can arrest you forcibly at gunpoint, restrain you, and some states, the state has a right to exercise the death penalty under certain conditions. So, and individuals don't have the same right. So this idea that the state is kind of a body that's authority is based in the way in which it claims that its use of violence is legitimate, I think is really important. But the question is, what happens when different states are giving themselves the right to violence, but those two rights to violence clash? Those two states are clashing in violent ways, or where a state acts against its own citizens. So looking at this, we can see two things going on. Okay, not only does the state have enormous physical resources, not only does it have like the entire army, the military apparatus, the police apparatus, all of those things. It also can create interpretative frameworks, that it also has control over education, media. It can produce nationalistic narratives that create certain kinds of identities and interpretations of the world. It tells a kind of a story of itself, a history of that nation, that can be used to justify certain kinds of violence. So we need to look at the kind of ideological resources that states can mobilize, and not only states, other centers of power. Where you have massive concentrations of wealth, like where you have billionaires or transnational companies, they can do similar things in terms of mobilizing ideological resources that normalize or justify or incite violence. Um, and this process of ideological legitimation, is something that we want to think about very deeply. And because it really gets into how people come to believe that certain kinds of violence are justified, and to support those acts of violence. I mean, think of the problem. How does the state get people to go to war? How does it get an ordinary person to leave their job, leave their family, and go and kill people? That's a very difficult thing to get most people to do. So you have to have a very powerful narrative explaining why that person should do that, making it feel necessary and justified. Because otherwise they'd be like, actually, I'd just prefer to carry on living my life. So we need to think about these ideological legitimations that happen at those levels. And when we look at it, what's interesting is these competing accounts. Okay, so we look at Russia, Ukraine. So Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, and immediately the world reacted and was like, "This is an illegal war of aggression." Russia was like, "No, this is not a war. This is not counter to international human rights law. This is simply a special military operation." So they created this term, special military operation, in order to claim that they weren't going to war. And then they banned the use of the word war. Like, journalists were not allowed to use the word war, and they closed down newspapers and they arrested journalists. So the state used its mechanisms to stop people thinking about the invasion of Ukraine as a war, and replaced that with an understanding of that this was a defense against NATO's encroachment onto their territories, and it was an attempt to save kind of culturally Russian Ukrainians from the effect of Nazis who were alleged to be part of the Ukrainian military. Similarly, you see with the US's invasion of Iran, you have the story of there's this rogue state that supports terrorist organizations, is now developing nuclear weapons, and so the US has to go in and stop them. Whereas from the Iranian point of view, this is just a simple illegal war of aggression. This is the crime of crimes. They're being bombed, even though like schools are being bombed by the state that has no justification and no rights to attack it. So you have these two competing accounts of the attacks on Iran. And what's interesting is the different sort of media, and one of the innovations that came out of this was kind of AI war propaganda produced by Iran, which no one expected. This series of Lego videos where they countered the American Western media version of the attack with a critical counter narrative that not only showed the attacks as unjustified, but showed the US as being a country consistently committing crimes of violence. Okay. But moving on to the example that we're going to explore in a lot of depth today, which is the Palestine-Israel example. And the question immediately is, well, what kind of example is this? Is it a nation defending itself against terrorism? Is it a war? Is it a colonial occupation? Is this ethnic cleansing and genocide? All these different versions are around us. And people believe them, and they believe them very, very strongly in some cases. Well, they literally have to believe them strongly enough in order to be able to fight this conflict, that people are prepared to fight and die over this conflict. So how are these understandings produced? How are these completely opposite meanings of the Palestine-Israel conflict produced? And one of the things we see is that it's not just the individual claims that are important. It's the way that the individual claims about this event and that event and October 7th and bombing of hospitals and how these are fitted into much deeper underlying narratives about the meaning of those places, the meaning of those people's national identities. And one of the things that we've been talking about is the way in which people just don't believe stuff that researchers are fully agreed on. Researchers know the homicide rate is decreasing. Researchers know that guns don't really make people safer. We've talked about all of that. But the question is that there's a contestation around the word genocide. So amongst people, most researchers, international human rights lawyers, violence scholars, it's long accepted that this falls clearly within the definition of genocide. There's a case at the International Court of Justice for the crime of genocide. There are arrest warrants for the prime minister and former head of the military in Israel. But there's still a sense of like, no, we shouldn't use that word. And we see the news media just refusing to use that word. It's too volatile and inflammatory a word to use. And one of the reasons is because what people think the word genocide means. There's a kind of popular meaning, right? Which is genocide means you just kill everyone in a particular group. There's a much more complicated legal definition than that. And that legal definition is the one that's usually used is the 1948 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And they identify some key points. Like, firstly, the one we know, any of several acts, okay, with the intention, and it does specify intention. The first is the one everyone kind of thinks of, is killing members of a group. It doesn't mean killing all the members of a group. It just means killing the intention to kill members of a group because they are members of a group. Remember, the Bosnian genocide, only about 12,000 people were killed. It wasn't millions of people. But secondly, in that definition, this is very important that we look at these more closely, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Okay, so there you don't have to kill people in the group. You simply have to make them suffer in certain systematic ways. And that is understood as on its own genocidal. And thirdly, and this is the one that I think is perhaps most relevant of all in this case, is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So what that's saying is, you don't have to shoot people, you don't have to put people in gas chambers. You can simply try and destroy the world in which they live, destroy their schools and roads and hospitals and agricultural land and urban infrastructure, and so that life becomes so difficult that group cannot survive as a functioning group anymore. And I think this is one of the most strongly applied definitions in this particular case. So what we're going to do this week then is look at two different pieces. The one is a paper called Irreconcilable Differences, which looks at why the Palestinian version and the Israeli version are so completely at odds with each other. These are just different worlds explaining what is happening. And it tries to make sense of that by looking at the groups involved in terms of their underlying social histories, and especially their social histories of historical trauma, of intergenerational trauma that precede this particular conflict. Okay. It then also tries to contrast the kind of ideologically constructed versions of the conflict with more evidence-based historical versions of the conflict, but also acknowledging that both versions are in a sense constructed in a certain way, but some of them are really constructed on identifiable falsehoods. And the third thing is it looks at why there's such deep polarization. Why, for instance, most of the global South supports Palestine and and most of the kind of former colonizers of Western society support Israel. Whilst there's a Western global South, colonizer, colonized, and also a youth older generation split around how these things should be interpreted. Okay. The second major work we're looking at is a film. It's a film called Israelism, which is made by young American filmmakers. And it's really looking at how Jewish youth in the United States are given ways of understanding the conflict. And this gets to the heart of our issue of how are people's understandings kind of produced, how they're ideologically manufactured using certain kinds of mechanisms, okay? But that's not what's important. What's important is that it's about how people come to critically reflect on themselves and to realize that perhaps their beliefs are not really justifiable, and how when they're presented with kind of new and challenging information, they can do different things with it. They can either reject it or they can consider it and revise their understandings based on that. And how different interactions with different people, different interactions in different spaces can suddenly give people a different sense of the world to the one that they were raised with. And so it's about transformation. It's about how people's ideas of violence change, but it's also about how difficult that is and the social costs and the psychological challenges of going through a process of a transforming understanding of something. So those two together really get to the heart of the question of how do understandings become polarized, but also how do understandings transform within individuals and communities. And some context to this, which I think is really interesting, is we've seen now a spate of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic acts of violence, both in Melbourne and in Australia in the past few years. But not only that, we've seen a really orchestrated set of attacks on journalists, on researchers, on artists of all kinds, musicians, writers, because they were covering Palestine, because they were representing the experiences of Palestinian people during the genocide, and they were deliberately and in a highly organized way attacked, fired from their jobs, lost funding, and this has then been contested. And in some cases, the people who've been attacked have actually succeeded in having whatever their actions against them reversed legally. At the same time, we saw that horrific Bondi Beach anti-Semitic mass violence, the murder of 15 people, and this leading to the Royal Commission on Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion. But at the same time, there's some really interesting things going on there. There's also been an attempt to kind of impose on institutions a very particular definition of anti-Semitism, the IRA definition. And one of the things that's contested there is that definition tries to kind of blur the distinction between acts of anti-Semitism and criticisms of the acts of the State of Israel. And this is really problematic. And we see this coming out in the testimonies at the Royal Commission, is that there's, amongst many of the speakers, there seems to be a real conflation of actual experiences of anti-Semitism with their anxieties about people visibly supporting Palestinian human rights. So you get these things like people, saying a certain Palestinian human rights phrase is experienced as attack, or someone describing how in taking the lift up to work, the ABC News is playing on a screen in the lift, and the screen is showing atrocities committed by the State of Israel, and they complain that is anti-Semitic, which clearly is a very strange use of the word anti-Semitic. And if the word is used in that way, it's being used to deliberately deny the human rights of Palestinian people. And similarly, we saw this thing, there were many regular big protests, anti-genocide protests in Melbourne. And we had some people some Jewish people saying, "Oh well, I'm afraid to go to town because every Sunday there are these protests going on and really should be stopped. It creates a hostile atmosphere for us." Or students going on campus and seeing, anti-genocide demonstrations and saying, "Well, as Jewish students, we don't feel comfortable with this." And yet, paradoxically, at the same time, in those protests are people holding up big signs saying Jews against genocide. So what's going on here? Why are some people saying, well, I don't feel comfortable with people advocating for Palestinian human rights because that makes me feel attacked as a Jewish person. And yet amongst those very people engaging in those encampments, those social protests in the middle of the city, are people very publicly with very big signs identifying as being Jewish and feeling completely safe in those communities. And we saw this happening at the Royal Commission. We saw both Jewish groups like the Australian Jewish Council, represented by the human rights advocate Sarah Swartz, saying that this is really problematic and talking about how difficult it is being attacked both by like neo-Nazis on the one hand and by her own Jewish community on the other hand, because she advocates for Palestinian human rights. And similarly, we saw student activists talking about their experiences being both Jewish and of being very activist in the context of Palestinian human rights, and how difficult that was for them. And this is a really interesting example to me, because it shows how people can be placed in very conflicted social positions, that they can have complex and changing understandings of violence, and this can affect their social relationships with their families, with their friends, with their communities. And how does one negotiate a kind of a critical sense of things when that more critical sense actually brings you into conflict with the people you care about? And I think this is a really interesting question that is explored both in this context, but is explored really in a very thoughtful and reflective way in Israelism. Okay, so those two things for you: irreconcilable differences in Israelism, to think about how do we understand these state acts of violence, but also how do we understand the way these different positions are felt as anti-Palestinian or felt as anti-Semitic, how they experienced through a set of meanings, and to try and get to the heart of understanding that.